right.
Perfect. Now we're good to go. All right. So I see everybody joining. We see some people still joining. We'll get started in just a minute. I'm Eric Silverman. This is my good friend, Nick Rockwell, president of Eastbridge Consulting. Real quick shout out, as I'll do throughout the event, to our hosts and sponsor, BCS Financial. If you've seen me talk about them on LinkedIn, if you've been part of these web chats before, I am a huge fan of BCS. And ultimately, I really do believe they are one of the best kept hidden secrets or hidden gems that should no longer be hidden in the, I hate the term voluntary, but the voluntary industry, worksite, supplemental, enhanced, ancillary, whatever you want to call it. They should no longer be a secret. So if you are an advisor, a broker, a consultant, a carrier, independent carrier rep on the line, and you don't know much about BCS, please check them out on their website, bcsf.com. You will not be disappointed. So with that, Nick, you ready to get this party started?
You bet, buddy. You bet.
All right, man. Well, Nick's going to go ahead and share his screen. And here's the deal, guys. Here's what our goal is. We're going to let Nick go over the data screen by screen. And then I'm here to liven it up a little bit, right? I'm going to give some perspective and some insight, things that I've seen in the market personally that may or may not jive with the data, which is totally okay. And you guys would have your own experience too. Anybody, of course, listening in. So as you have questions, don't be shy. Put them in the chat box or put them in the question box, and we will get to them, no doubt. So Nick, go for it, my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things from my side. First and foremost, thank you to BCS for helping to organize this. Eric, thanks to you as always. You know, we've done this kind of thing in the past live and got really good feedback, and excited to do it again. And hopefully we'll find ways to make it more of a regular thing. I was thinking about it as I was logging in. I saw that we, you know, in my presentation, I have it labeled as industry trends and the day-to-day broker realities. And in the promotion, we did it as versus. And I think what you said is a perfect point. You know, the reality is it's not data is one of those things that you use to go directionally, right? But at the end of the day, everybody has a unique experience in the market. And I think what's great about the conversation we've been able to have in the past and on your vlog and
podcast.
Your podcast, absolutely, is just being able to give different perspective. So what Eastbridge does, just for those of you who aren't as familiar with us, is we're an advisory not for employers relative to voluntary benefits. We're not a broker. We advise carriers typically. We do have other companies that we support in the industry, but we've always done so with data. So we do a ton of research. So many people are familiar with us, but I don't always want to assume that people understand the lens we're coming from. And over time, we've tried to get that data out in a variety of different ways. And this was one that Eric and I landed on, one to say, hey, let's look at what the data says about some stuff. And let's see what other winds are blowing given to those given topics. So without further ado, I'll jump into that. But it's definitely not a data dump. We're going to have a discussion here and kind of bounce around a little bit. In terms of the theme, we're really looking at most of the data from a broker survey we did the previous year. I do have a couple other data points here and there. So we're really trying to speak to the majority of the distribution community and kind of what's going on in that bit of the market. So let me throw this up and we'll dive in. Eric, you yell at me if something's not working, okay?
No, looks beautiful. We were ready to roll.
Cool. So the first data point I just wanted to have out there, because it's a natural question, especially, you know, on the heels of the pandemic, is what sales have looked like in voluntary benefits. And you've got the entire, you know, going back 22 plus years here now, right? So pretty healthy industry, save 2010 when ACA was a big disruption, and then the pandemic, obviously. But the reality of what we were seeing during those times is this wasn't anything to do with like certain brick and mortars having a problem, not being able to get people into the stores. It wasn't that voluntary became less valuable. It was that it had to become a prioritized issue, right? So when we worked with carriers, we were finding that it wasn't necessarily participation. It wasn't people's employees' interest in these products. It was quoting, right? And that makes absolute all the sense in the world that things had to be prioritized. Now, lo and behold, as we suspected, the next year was a big boost. You know, we saw about a 10% growth last year, which is about double what we would normally see. Now, that didn't take us back to pre-pandemic levels, but based on the things I'm hearing throughout the year from carriers, that sales are coming back up. Does that sort of jive with what you've been seeing Eric, is that people are, even this year, even more than last year, kind of fast and furious looking to explore new programs.
Yeah, for sure. I do agree with this data point, but I would say, just living through it, 2020 was not a terrible year for me. I can't speak for the whole industry, but 2020, I'm talking about business wise, of course, right?
Sure.
We had an increase in sales. We had more and more employers in 2020, certainly 21, and my God, now in 22, adding more and more benefits. In fact, more and more employers are adding these benefits that the status quo industry still, makes me nauseous to say, calls voluntary. They're adding these benefits that are not so voluntary. They're partially employer funding or completely employer funding in various respects, which I'm sure we'll get to in a little while.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually kind of a good segue into the next one. I wish I had that data set up a little bit, because you teed something up there. And it's true. The reality of the overall market, even in 2020, is that there were very different experiences at the carrier level. So you had some carriers that were significantly down. Some of them were carriers who, commanded a great deal of sales and market share slice of the pie, and that takes an entire industry a certain direction. We had some companies that were up or down, or excuse me, up in that year, but then last year we're down. Interestingly, you wouldn't think you'd see that. You'd think you'd see some tailwinds. So everybody's got the individual perspective and approaches to market impacting that a great deal. The biggest thing I wanted to point out on here is, we get asked to look at this data quite a bit, and try to kind of give a sense for what are some of the carriers writing the most business here. But one of the most interesting pieces of information that I always like to impress upon people is the top 15 companies accounting today for about 72% of sales. The reality is that used to be more like 85%. So we're seeing that number get a little bit smaller, and that's typically relegated back to the fact that we have so many different options in here. And I know we tried to point this out in the past, that the reality is there's a lot of different solution providers out there, and that's really what most companies are trying to do, right? It's not just bring you a product, but bring you an end-to-end solution, bring you maybe more specific tools for your clientele as a broker and your niche in the market. And that is starting to change the shape of the landscape. There's some 60, 65, some odd voluntary benefit carriers out there providing a lot of different options.
Nick, can I ask you a question on this slide?
Yeah.
It's probably a question that a lot of folks might have, and I know we covered it when we've done this presentation before. So in these carriers, these top 5, right? Aflac, I believe, and you give me correction if I'm wrong, Aflac, I believe, reports their individual group chassis and their group chassis combined. So there's 14.3, and I'm sure it includes all their other, I hate the word ancillary carriers, but I think Colonial and Unum, they report it separately and independently. So would I be right or wrong to say that Unum group of companies would represent 11%?
Yeah, without the specific date, but yeah, you're in the ballpark, and that's a good way of looking at it. Obviously, you can see them in third and fourth, right there behind it. Obviously, the differences in approaches and some of the different structures there are different. Portfolios are
right. They're branded separately. They run autonomously. Absolutely. I get it, but at the end of the day, Colonial is still within Unum's group as the parent company.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, to kind of segue into some of the broker data here, a data point that I think is always helpful to look at is kind of what role does voluntary play today in a broker's toolkit. And over time, we've watched things really go from an occasional sale, right, across the board here to a much more selling it actively component. And that's tabled out a little bit, but we still see a significant number around cross-selling and selling it actively. So Eric, I know we're speaking near and dear to your heart. Obviously, this is your bread and butter. But I imagine this is also suggesting and signaling to you, there's more and more people looking for partners when it comes to being in the voluntary business and learning how to get their feet wet.
Well, what I've seen is there's usually a finite segment of, or I should say a division of labor, for lack of a better term. So there's quote unquote full service, major medical health advisor, brokers, consultants, whatever terminology they want to give themselves, who, as right in there, they would probably more times fall into the sell occasionally. Most of them don't want to get involved. They don't want to deal with it. No worries. Then you have some that are a little bit more proactive than others, but I will tell you they're few and far between, whereby they're proactively bringing in some suite or host of employee funded enhanced benefit type programs. And usually what I'm seeing, and I don't know if you have data around this, but what I'm seeing is if you have ABC brokerage anywhere in the country and they are full-time, full service medical, but they do proactively introduce quote unquote voluntary benefits, what I see myself is that they're typically pretty married to one carrier or another. They're not typically going out and shopping the market and taking a more agnostic approach the way they would if they're shopping Blue Cross, Aetna, United, Kaiser, what have you. In this respect, they're typically bolting on to one local team that they like, whomever carrier it is irrelevant. And that's really what their client base gets. And then you have folks that would rather outsource it to a SME, a subject matter expert, a firm like myself or many others that doesn't really care in a good way about the carrier, where they're truly going to shop the market and take that holistic approach of, hey, this carrier is strong here, this carrier is strong there, that carrier is strong there, and then really dive in and make a customized, bespoke package that makes the most sense for the employer. At the end of the day, I'm guilty as charged. I did it for 15 years. So don't be sending me any hate mail. But the reality is when you're a brokerage and you're only representing one carrier, God bless you, but you might as well carry that business card for that carrier. I prefer the holistic agnostic approach, at least over the last near decade for me.
Absolutely. So everything you're describing fits with a lot of the segmentation that we do. So, we definitely have a spectrum of producers out there. And, in our work, we still see that there are a lot of carriers that have kind of pivoted into voluntary, and they do maybe initially one of two things. They work with a carrier that they know from their true group side. Right. So they're maybe working with the medical carrier who's got it. If they've got a voluntary line, they're working with a more true group oriented carrier who maybe has added those products. And the reality is, if you go back to like kind of early 2000s, that was a time when some of those companies that were pivoting into it, they were really good at their bread and butter. They weren't as good yet at worksite, right? They didn't have all the capabilities. And that led to an era of sort of maybe best in class on the true group employer paid, but I'm not over here. And so then you find brokers kind of stepping from there to more full service, voluntary supplemental health environment, right? So can I get all the employee pay all, right, products kind of under one roof? But we've continued to see a trend that, if you're an enrollment specialist, if you're kind of a true classic voluntary broker, yes, you're very selective. Oftentimes you're very selective with carriers because you've kind of figured out who's good and who's bad. But to your point, some take such a management role in the process that it really limits the experience that an employer and employee is going to have from enrollment through billing to have a poor carrier experience, because they're really kind of playing such a role there. But yeah, we've definitely seen more your true employee benefit broker, those who grew up selling employer paid products, making that a decision to actually get to that fork in the road. Do I partner for this? Do I call someone like you? Or do I really learn about it? Do I finally dive into this and build a business around it? And there's some that go both ways, obviously. So yeah, very, very good. So we want to talk a little bit about product. So we've got two columns here, and what you were describing is really a big part of what we help carriers understand, is that brokers are not all the same. They're not all homogenous by any means. And this is just one high level classification where we kind of take people on the spectrum. We say they're definitely more food on the table doing voluntary employee pay all type products versus maybe the medical employer paid products, and really just speaking to where they started. So I've kind of highlighted here the differences in their top 5 products. These are in order of what the research found. But you see two things, right? You see similarity and you see distinction here. And the first thing I'd say about it is, 10, 12 years ago, these were completely different groups. So you definitely had people talking about different value propositions, right? You had people trying to protect and do different things. A lot of that wasn't because they thought those protections were more important. Again, the employee benefit brokers naturally gravitated towards dental because it's easy, right? So it was an easy place to start. So we see these differences now, but also some similarities where we're starting to see, those supplemental health products becoming, a real battleground in the value proposition that people have, but still some sticking to their guns on, again, term insurance, much bigger on the, with the classic employee benefit broker versus, maybe a specialist or somebody's going to tell that universal life story. But I know you've got some thoughts on product as well.
Nick, let me ask you a question for some clarity. Do you put, does Eastbridge categorize vision separately, or is that dental/vision and it's just not listed?
No, it is separately, and it's just
interesting. I mean, my goodness, I've been in the business 23 years now, and you have the data going back prior to that. Would you agree that years ago, vision would have been on this list right underneath or above dental?
Yeah, it may have been more before my time, but absolutely, yeah. I mean, vision is sort of always gone hand in hand, right? I think dental's seen some different changes, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm looking at this slide right here particularly, what I'm seeing is certainly more and more core becoming the accident CI hospital. For benefit brokers themselves, I always hear them identify dental and life as a core product. They identify accident and CI more as a ancillary or supplement. But I'm personally I still see disability as a core product. In fact, when I'm out there discussing it with the market myself, through brokers and advisors, a lot of folks know I don't work direct, so everything I do is through an advisor that brings me aboard. But we don't categorize disability alongside accidents and critical illness or hospital per se.
Right.
We keep it in that core mix. So for us, the core is typically life, dental, vision, disability, both short or long term, any variation of life per se. But that's the core for us. When it comes to segmenting the enhanced benefits, as I like to call them, that's when I would segment it to the accident, the CI, the hospital, or any other variety of solutions that may not be carrier insurance, such as pet benefits or prepaid legal or identity theft or any number of solutions that are in the marketplace.
Sure, absolutely. And it's funny in the way you mentioned disability, because on the carrier side, that portfolio that they have the capability to offer, right? Some don't have a life license as they get into the market. Others are specialists in life, and they don't have the actuarial experience with the supplemental health products. So every carrier has a different position that they're coming from relative to all that. And I was just talking with a carrier this morning who was sort of in a more unique spot lately, and that disability was the gap. They've got several different forms of life insurance, and now the supplemental health suite, though it may need some work, but that disability piece again is and so that triangulation of finding brokers they can support is still, it's an important thing. That if you have some of those gaps, it's going to be one of the first reasons that people are sort of trepidatious with it. So another thing I wanted to ask you is, I think you've told me in the past too that you've seen employers more now than ever willing to look at some of the supplemental health products through an employer paid lens too, right?
Big time. And the interesting thing is the key behind employer funding or employers funding any traditional voluntary supplemental type plan. You have to ask for it. You have to explain it. It's not really complicated. We're all sales professionals on this call. You can't be shy. If you go into a meeting and you talk about voluntary as voluntary, then guess what it's going to always be? Oh yeah, voluntary. That's literally what it's always going to be. But if you take a completely different approach and you go into the meeting with the employer on the same page, if you're direct, great. If you get brought in like I do through an advisor or broker, make sure you're on the same page. But when you go into that employer group and you explain what the market is trending, when you explain the data, when you explain the reason and the why, then you're going to see much more uplift on employers deciding to take a portion on themselves with respect to these enhanced benefits that are typically employee funded. We have employer groups by and large that will fund a certain product or two, or we have employer groups that will decide to allocate a certain budget in a defined contribution type methodology. Either way, you have to remember everything's voluntary. Even when employers pay for a portion of the medical, it's still voluntarily up to the employee to take advantage of and pay their other portion. But we don't call medical voluntary benefits. So again, I encourage everybody, I've been preaching it for literally years. You got to get that vernacular out of your mind and start imploring employers. Is that a term?
Yeah.
I have a friend on here who's going to mess with me later. Hi, Rachel. The reality is you have to implore the employer to do the right thing. And look, they're never, ever, ever going to fund it unless they know that it's an option. Because I tell you what, every single broker they've ever talked to, every single carrier rep they've ever talked to, nobody's ever brought it up as a potential employer funded benefit. Talk about a different, unique approach to attracting and retaining talent in this market.
And I think that's where the sort of the lack of strategy shows itself sometimes, that a lot of times producers might not be thinking through the lens of how do these products really work holistically. And we stop at the water's edge and say, oh, well, these are the employee paid products, right? And it brings you back to something I know we're going to get to at some point, but it's participation. And I won't dive into it too much now because there's so many different places we could talk about it. But the participation from most voluntary offerings does not cover enough people to have any kind of real impact at an employer holistic level, right? So if I'm offering accident because my high deductible plan got higher and I'm really playing that out of pocket angle, well, I can keep adding these products. But if I have 3 and 4 and 5% participation on them, I'm not really covering people and changing those outcomes. So I think there's a couple other places those elements will probably come up more in our discussion.
Hey,
right?
Nick, real quick before, and you can keep it on screen if you want, but before we go into that screen, couple quick reminders. Number one, we're seeing some good questions come in. Don't worry. We see you, Kerrigan and Marty and everybody. We're going to get to them. Don't worry. We also see some other folks coming in with questions in the chat box. Please use the Q&A box so we can not mess up and accidentally miss something. And if you have any comments, of course, use the chat box. And lastly, but certainly not least, I can't help but plug again and thank our sponsor and host today, BCS Financial. Check them out, BCS Financial, bcsf.com. They have an incredible accidental critical illness hospital program, fixed medical indemnity program that you really need to check out. And I'll give you my quick 2 cents on it. And I've said it before. In fact, I have another article coming out about it in one of the big trade publications. I'm a big believer in being different when it comes to the carriers that I represent. So every carrier, I don't want to offend anybody that's with a carrier that's on this call, but every carrier listed on that first slide in the top 15, they're fantastic. I've worked with most of them. However, they're not exactly unique or different in and of itself. There's not a single advisor, broker, consultant out there that couldn't work with those carriers or doesn't already or isn't already appointed in some capacity. What I love about BCS, and there's other carriers too, I love that they're boutique, that they're different, they're unique, and that they're it's funny because they're not new, but they're a newer entrant to the market with respect to branding. They're A-rated, and when you bring something to the table that other brokers, advisors haven't brought to the table for an employer, that's where you start to stand out and differentiate. And for those of you that have been with a carrier for a long time, you may remember back 10, 20 years ago with those carriers when you could pick up the phone and talk to an executive and get something happen if you needed, if you had a challenge. That's the feel that this carrier has as of the moment. And I have no doubt they're going to be in that top 15 relatively quick. So anyway, check them out, bcsf.com. Nick, let's keep going, my friend.
Yeah, it's all good stuff. So this slide brings us to some stuff you already mentioned, right? Is what about the use of the more non-traditional products? And nowadays with some of these percentages, it's kind of hard to call them non-traditional. I mean, I think it still makes sense to give some classification to more unique, typically non-insurance focused type plans. And certainly when it comes to the kind of the synchronizing of an open enrollment or determining what order of the benefits we're going to have, we have to look through those lenses. But some of these percentages have gotten pretty big in terms of broker representation. So identity theft has become something that, I remember years ago when I was in that market, these numbers were like 5% on both sides. So to have just about half on either side of the aisle here in distribution, representing that as kind of a top non-traditional product, doesn't surprise me given the years that have passed, but it is, as you look back on it, a big change, right? And legal plans is another one that has a little bit more distance between the more voluntary expertise type broker and the story that is told in those products versus the benefit brokers. And you can see some of the wellness types of things might be more top of mind among a true benefit broker. And there's some things on here that I think we'll start seeing next year. So we do give people options to write things in. That gives us a sense to be able to start quantifying what the actual broker population is seeing as a new thing. My guess is that next year you might see that category of auto repair. We've seen some of that, Eric, I know, pop up here and there. That's one of those things where on the surface, the producer might say, geez, I got to talk about, auto repair coverage as an employee benefit. But if you look at it through a prevalence or severity type of lens, right? Severity, absolutely there for a critical illness plan or hospital indemnity. That's a severe situation. That's a different kind of costly health related situation. But from a prevalence standpoint, vehicle problems, that's the type of thing that people are dealing with every day and everybody can relate to, right? Maybe different times of our lives. So all of these different lifestyle benefits, whatever you want to call them, are kind of having their day at different times.
So I'm going to predict now. I mean, I've seen it, and I think you have data from years past to support it as well. I'm predicting that the pet benefits side is going to skyrocket past discount health, wellness, legal, financial, student loan. It's going to skyrocket. And I can't wait to see the full on 2022 numbers when hopefully we do something like this again next year. That's a prediction that I don't think is even that bold. I don't have to go out on a limb here. I'm seeing it on a day-to-day basis. My goodness, if anybody is listening here on the Zoom and watching us, every single one of those plans listed on the screen is incredible, including the new up-and-coming one, which I think is going to start getting some traction. It's still some time away, in my opinion, but even the vehicle protection plan. But I'm telling you, there's not a call that I have with an employer where at some point in the conversation, there's not a dog in the background on Zoom, or there's not a cat crawling across the screen, or there's not the question that comes up about new ideas they can do to really help the population. And if you think about it, if more than half of your population owns an animal and ultimately they care about them because it's a four-legged family member, it's a fur baby, as they're called, why wouldn't you make it available? And in my opinion, I've seen it to be the easiest of all easy to add as an additive alongside any other enhanced benefit program. And we're even seeing many employers pay for it. Now, keep in mind, those listening, you're not offering, in my opinion, if I'm wrong, tell me, but I don't offer any of these programs as a direct compensation model, meaning, do they pay comp? Sure. Some of them better than others. But the reality is the big reason you bring it is for employee engagement. When you start emailing employees and the employer starts announcing and letting everybody know that there's pet benefits being made available or pet insurance, the engagement skyrockets. Employees really, I don't know, Nick, it's painful. I've been in benefits for 20 plus years. It's painful to hear and know that an employee would be quicker to learn and get a quote about Fluffy's pet insurance than they are about disability or life or accident. But it is an absolute fact. So, there's a saying.
So leverage it, right?
Leverage it. There's a saying in the news, don't bury the headline. The headline for marketing and communication is pet benefits. The minutia, which makes us money, that we need, that we want, that we value, is the dental, vision, accident, cancer, critical illness. That's all important. Don't get me wrong. But that's not the headline that's exciting. The sizzling headline is pet benefits. That's the hook that drives engagement.
And I could agree more. And this is where our different experiences, be it such different roles we play in the industry. I love it when they triangulate like this and line up, because we've supported a number of different providers from these types of categories. And what we've seen happen so much in the past is they're so quick to be feature creature, right? I am out there trying to convince you I have got the best pet insurance plan. I have got the best wellness plan. I've got the best identity theft coverage. And most brokers, in their candid with me, are sort of like, I've got too many different things to become like an expert about the feature creature of all these little categories. So what we're always trying to help people understand is they'll get behind your product if there's consumer value there, but you need to find a value that fits into their book. You need to find a value that gets into their strategy. So for example, I think we've talked about this story before. I mean, a couple of different of these categories, whether it be legal plans, identity theft, genomics, we've helped some providers in different categories like that go out and try to really find a way to say, hey, let's help people sell more critical illness, right? On the genomic side, I know we've worked with some people who do, how do I get you that open enrollment face-to-face opportunity, or how do I get you some working condition that you didn't have before in offering something that plays more to their compensation from those products than anything. And I just have to second on the pet insurance stuff. I don't disagree on the growth there. I think one of the things that's happened there is the category has matured a lot. So now you don't just have insurance, you have discount plans, right? And those are two different ways to skin the cat, pardon the pun, right?
Don't do that. They might need pet benefits.
I know, geez, that just came out. I don't know if that's a bad thing or not, but in any event, the disparity in those things gives brokers an opportunity to be consultative, right? I'm not just coming and talking to you about insurance, but I'm talking to you about which way do we try to solve the problem before we get to carrier solutions. So I totally agree. I think that's all happening. I think that category is maturing. All right, I'm gonna jump to another one here real quick. So this is kind of coming on the back of what we looked at before. I don't know, we'll spend a lot of time here. It was just to kind of call it, we looked at the products, just to kind of call out some of the similarities and differences. And I don't do this to highlight, obviously these are some pretty top 10 carriers, what have you, that fall into this list. It's more to get highlight the sort of between the voluntary and benefit broker, and where we're seeing some similarity in messaging, what's resonating, but some carriers shining through more than others, where they're on one side of the list, but not on the other. And that's to me, that's a sign of still people kind of having some appreciation for specialization. And I think if you really drew this list out further, if we could get that kind of granular in a survey, you'd see some other really interesting things as you get into like a top 20, top 30 carriers, as you're stating kind of at the outset there. A lot of times that's where you're really finding the differentiation, right? And you're finding the engagement with the carrier and the support that's a little bit more customized. But that was just something that we wanted to call out as just sort of a change from the past.
Right. And I don't see any major objections or things that I see here that I'm not already experiencing. But this is a perfect example, everybody. And I just use as an example. These are not a single carrier listed is not a carrier that anybody on this Zoom can represent, including the 100,000 other brokers and advisors out there that already do or could do it themselves. Think different, think big, differentiate. Make sure you're working with a smaller mid-sized boutique carrier that can certainly give these guys a run for their money, but at the same token, provide a quality program that you can be proud of and that the employer can be proud of. And again, it's not to denigrate any of these carriers. Heck, I represented one of them forever, and the others I've sold. I still sell. I make renewal checks every year. Thank you. It's just a matter of being different. That's all. I'm trying to give you some sales points and some tips to win new deals.
And down that same line, the other thing I like to point out with this is that the general trend we see in other data points, this is not necessarily the most indicative of it, but if we looked at a number of other carrier related data points in terms of broker feedback, what you start to see is you see a lot more specialization. So more and more we see like the number of voluntary carriers relative to the voluntary or employee pay all products that a broker is bringing into a case. It used to be one, right? It's like, I only want one. I won't have to deal with more than one. Well, now, depending on the type of broker, you might have 3, 4 different carriers. Now, that's not necessarily a suggestion to go out and do that, but I imagine with your specialization, you've seen where I can do that in best of breed in certain situations. Maybe it makes sense. Maybe I only need 2, but that direction towards being able to say, I don't need it all under one roof because it's all on one bill. I have others ways to make the billing work well. And I can go and say, hey, these people really have the best programs for your population, carrier to carrier. That's another thing. I'm curious what you think of that, because that's just another trend we've seen in a lot of things.
I would say if you surveyed the average broker, advisor, consultant, and you surveyed the average employer, small to mega size, every one of them is going to say that in and if we lived in a perfect world, we don't, they would love to have it under one roof. Come on, to have 5, 6, 7 programs being made available, employer funded, employee funded, all with the same carrier, all with the same bill. Doesn't it sound perfect? Come on, I'm not stupid. You're not stupid. It sounds amazing. But there are times where it's not as beneficial by far, and that's where you serve your value as a benefit advisor, a broker, or a VB carrier rep. The reality is you have to know enough to explain the differences and be proud enough to say, we're amazing at this, but this product, even though we have it, I might recommend you look at something else. That's where, as a carrier rep, you're going to get the most respect led to you by a broker and advisor when you're open enough to tell them the truth, that you can't and don't want to do it all. I very much love putting together custom packages for employers of all sizes, even a 10-man group. But sometimes the employer isn't on board, and therefore you have to default to more of an all-inclusive carrier. And there's plenty of them out there that are more than adequate for most things.
Absolutely.
Hey, I was just going to say, we're at 25 minutes left. I want to dive into just a couple quick questions, and then we'll get back here. So I'll ask them to you. I'll feed through here. One is easy. Kerrigan, that probably everybody wants to know, will they have the ability to get these slides? Well, number one, the playback of this video will be made available to anybody that registered, so you can watch the video anytime you want on demand. You'll get an email from BCS Financial. Thank you, BCS. But as far as getting the specific slides, is there a way that they can get those? Because that I don't know, and this is your intellectual
my email,
property.
we like to track our data and kind of where it's going out and where it's used. But anybody on here can email me, and we'll get the information in your hand. So it's just N Rockwell, first initial last name at eastbridge.com, because I don't think I have that on the
and I put that in his LinkedIn's there on the chat. So connect with him on LinkedIn. You'll see everything. You can connect with him there. Now to some actual questions. I love Marty's question. We know Marty Trainer. Hey, Marty, good to have you on here, buddy. He said, do you see the 3-product supplemental medical market as the future, or will it be more a single product covering both medical plan gaps and the need for lump sum additional payouts? Nick, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'll lead off there. And yeah, Marty, great to see hear your name, and we need to catch up. So it's a really good question. So I think it's a fantastic idea. There's sort of two sides of the coin from what I've seen thus far, right? It's that if I have a product that can be more all-encompassing and not have to have hospital indemnity, critical illness, accident, all out there, and I kind of give it a more well-rounded product that kind of covers a lot of those features, to have that be a digestible price for people, you oftentimes have different coverage. There's some devil in the detail stuff that change. So it can be something nice to go in and say, hey, strategically, we can offer this one product. We're not going to have so many different products, and you really have some good coverages here. But in a situation where carrier already has certain products plugged in, how are we really going to look when we compare feature stuff? So when we're looking at the actual coverage levels, I think that's where you're gonna have some problems. We have so many cases in the market today that are takeovers. There's gonna be a lot of questions in that type of situation too. Can I really bring a product like that in? Not likely, because of those distinctions. But it is very interesting. But I just think at the end of the day, risk is risk. So if we're managing to bring those products together at the same coverage levels, they're going to appear expensive, even if it's the same as somebody buying all 3 of those products. But that's not necessarily a common thing to have an employee get enrolled into all 3 of those at least at one time. So I think it's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be a niche, but I just don't know if it's necessarily going to solve for the education problem entirely. So
bottom line on that question, Marty, good question. I'm already starting to see carriers putting these plans together, and I think it's going to increase. So I think an all-in-one product from carriers is certainly on the horizon, and some of them already have it, and they're starting to roll it out if it's not already been rolled out. I don't have personal experience with it as of yet, but I'm intrigued. I think it's a good premise to have more or less an accident, hospital, CI, cancer type plan all built into one. Maybe even figure out a way to include disability, and like if you can include it all in one, I think it streamlines the education process. But I don't think we're there yet. I don't see it happening by and large in 23. I'll predict not even 24, maybe 25, 26. Those products might start popping up more and be more relevant in the market. Brian has a question, Nick. I want to get to some more of these slides, but I also want to
Sure.
be nice to the audience here, kind enough to put in some questions. So
Yeah.
Brian Hawkins says, hey, Brian, what are you guys seeing from a medical claims integration space around member notifications for claimable event or even an auto, he's talking about auto adjudicating claims.
Yeah. So claims
We've talked about that, you and I, a lot.
Yeah. Claims integration is I think the most interesting topic in our space right now. It's a little buzzy. It's sort of one of these things it's had the last couple of years. It's taken on one of those buzzword types of terms that gets thrown around a lot. But we've seen a big evolution in a variety of data points, our carrier data points around employers, what they expect relative to this, and advisors and brokers. In a nutshell, there's a lot of change, but there's a lot of challenge too. So you specify medical claims integration here. First and foremost, just general claims integration. That's been happening more and more for, I don't know, the last 6-7 years at a minimum, right? Where a lot of carriers have kind of started to look and say, hey, what other claims can I get better at paying based on data I already have? And that might be, a voluntary line, employee paid line on an employer paid, disability or something like that, probably most commonly, right? So that's something that people have tried to connect those dots and kind of beef up that value proposition, both the employer and the employee. The reality is to get into the medical side of it, the first challenge is where's the data? Right. So if I'm a Cigna or an Aetna, I've got that all under one roof, though it's still not that simple. Most of those organizations, they wear the same brand, but they're not in the same building. So it's not like they can just, email the data over to Ted, right? It's a very sensitive topic, but all the technology is starting to get there, I think, to do that type of thing quickly. I do not think auto paying makes a whole lot of sense. As soon as you make one wrong auto payment to somebody, you've got an issue. You set a bad trend. I think the first step, crawl, walk, run for this industry is to get to a point where can we leverage all the data we have across carriers, different platforms, et cetera, and make it super easy for employees to get to that claim. And nothing would be easier in my mind than getting the check in the bank. But I think before that, it's a stop along the way to say, hey, here's an email, here's a notification. We saw that you had a medical event that you were diagnosed with cancer. You do have a critical illness plan. Have you looked into that with that carrier? Question also in this space is really around who's going to play the managing role. So carriers are trying to do that, but you could argue a Ben admin system is a better entity to try and play the role because they see all the providers in a given case. They might be touching EOBs, or they might have stuff going into their portal that could touch it better. Some of the benefit communication systems that are popping up, even those have a play for this. So we're seeing a lot change, Brian, is the answer. And I could talk about it for a long time. What I will tell you right now, I'm kind of jumping ahead of a couple of data points, but it's relevant to talk about. Our employer data tells us now, 4 years ago, we saw claims integration wasn't even on the list. 2 years ago, in terms of carrier selection, that's a data point I'm talking about here. Carrier selection wasn't even on the list. 2 years ago, it jumped to number 5. This last year, it was number 2, right after price and such. I don't think I have that data point in here. But the other side of that is that as you see the broker data around it, it's not nearly as big a deal. I've got a couple of things that we'll probably jump through here. But my biggest thing with the employers, I don't even know if employers really understand what it is, right? Yeah. Like I think they've read some things. I think they've heard some things that sound interesting, but until their advisor comes and gives them an honest discussion about what are the mechanics involved, what are the risks involved, who are the carriers we need to play with, I think there's a lot of question marks, but there is a lot happening. You got to do your homework.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what you said, buzzword. It's just a buzzword. The auto claims adjudication, it sounds appealing. It sounds awesome. I've had high-end executive level conversations with the C-suite at a number of carriers, many of which you named earlier. And it's something they're looking into. Some of them are a little bit ahead of the game, but I haven't seen anything substantial yet. It's still a buzzword. And by the way, I've had it asked of me with some larger accounts. And when we really peeled back the onion and started to go through it, every single one of them decided that it should not be a deciding factor in them selecting a carrier. Nick, let's keep going in this.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, I've got a data point or two in here to touch on that. And so on this slide, I just wanted to highlight that, this is about carrier selection from a broker standpoint. right? And, it used to be that you had so much of the product and price right in a line. And here nowadays, we're seeing that both sides of, again, that kind of distribution aisle, if you will, are talking a lot more about administration and service, and then integration with that admin community, as these are huge deciding factors, right? These are big decision points in terms of ease, what we're going to expect. And I think it's just a bottom line of having both types of producers experience benefits, the actual reality of working with these programs. And the reality is the product's thought a lot about up front. And then once it's installed, yes, claims are going to be made, but the lion's share of experience is the week to week, month to month experience the employer has with your billing, with your portal, with all those types of things that if we don't have them, they don't work well. They're going to lead to problems. And that's finally evidencing itself a lot more in the data.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, the fact that the order is slightly different between benefit brokers and voluntary brokers, it's not that drastically different,
No.
but I would tell you that too. I mean, you don't, a couple things. One, as a sales professional, you live and die based on price. So you win on price, you're going to lose on price. Somebody else is going to come in and be cheaper. So that can never be your value prop. The administration and service aspect to me is pretty paramount and powerful. I sell it really hard, to be honest with you. I probably did take the survey, but if I was taking this survey, I would put the administrative service integration of the enrollment, the Ben admin portal, all that. I would more put that number one, believe it or not, than I would anything else, just because the employee, they're not using the plan every second of the day and every week having to deal with it.
Right.
So the employee, we got to know it's A-rated. We got to know that it's a great rate and a great product. We have to know that they're going to get a claim paid. That's fine. That's good. Don't get me wrong. But my goodness, the human resource, the payroll account manager, the employer, they're dealing with this stuff every week. So if you don't button that up as, to me, number one, you are setting yourself up for some challenges, short and long term.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And, as we're going to segue into this next slide, I was referencing on as we were talking about claims integration, answering that question, you can see here where it lists in terms of selection criteria for producers. So again, both types of brokers pretty low on the list, as opposed to the employer market where it's been going up. So I think all of that, and I think I've got some data here that I'll just kind of tack this on real quick and then make some more comments about it. Here, this was a question, a deeper dive question about the level of importance, right? So as we go specifically looking at this, we want to understand how important. And it's sort of interesting that your kind of two biggest response boxes here and sort of evenly matched, right? But between benefit brokers and voluntary brokers, is that it's either very important or a nice to have, right? Instead of sort of trending towards one sort of direction, it's very much this sort of 50-50 in terms of I'm even looking at it. And then here, obviously, I think your take on it was, we've looked at it, it's not necessarily that important. And I would also say it just brings up more questions. And this is where we could talk about this for so long. For example, a takeover type of situation. If it is a situation where I'm representing an employer who already has the product installed, but I'm trying to give them presumably a better offering, right? Maybe the last product's out of date. Maybe we've had issues with the admin, whatever it is, right? If I'm going to go in and install that type of situation, well, if I'm moving to something that's going to have any kind of claims notification jump going on behind it, I've got new compliance questions about, can I use the same enrollment? Can I swap coverages? You're definitely, most likely going to have pricing coverages, some pricing issues that might make that level of change too much. So those are other things that even as an employer hears it, they have to be convinced that, people don't know what they have so much that they want this, that I'm willing to tell that story to them, that now you have that benefit for perhaps more money. So it just gets really complicated when you're looking at half the market already with a product installed, sort of similar, we were talking to kind of more one product fits all types of things. So I personally think this topic's got a lot of legs. It's just we're in that area now where people have to ask more questions. I think we all need to understand it more and learn who's going to kind of control it and see where sort of those chips start to fall. But it's just an interesting data point to me.
Hey, Nick, we got about 10 minutes left. I want to get through some more slides, but let me pause and give a couple quick questions. So Dan wants to know if Eastbridge tracks new sales versus rollover and takeover.
We do. I don't have any data in here. I mean, at the highest level, about 54% of new business annualized premium, which is the revenue benchmark that we were showing up front, is a takeover, right? So it's a case that is new to somebody. Let's put it that way, right? So it's new to that carrier's business, but they are stepping into a coverage that was already installed with an employer.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do track that, and it's about half the market. Now, we've seen that growing. I mean, I think 12, 15 years ago, it was like 10%, right? And it's gone up a little bit every year until 2-3 years ago, it really leveled out in this like 55% range. So there's still a ton of evergreen business being done, and it's not necessarily continuing to go. So that is not because it's saturated or anything like
that. Dan also had a follow-up. He said, do you have data, not necessarily today, just curious for the future, do you guys track data on the return of the mini med?
It's such a good question, timely question. I would not say that we have data on it right now, but it's going into we're going into our research planning for next year. And it's one of, maybe 5 things where I'm saying, how do we start looking at some of the trends that are going on around that? Because we have started to see a lot of these products that feel very much, like a mini med, that take a lot of different angles. So there's a lot of different variables in the ones that we've seen. Some of them are, true employer paid offerings as well. So we're trying to sort through that, but nothing I can offer right now. But it is an interesting observation.
So I'm just trying to make sure I don't miss anything. Guys, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. I'm looking through the chat to see that I don't miss any, but go ahead to the next one. I'll find a couple more and we'll start to wrap up here.
Yeah, a couple of things that I just had in here that were easy. We've always tracked this trend around asking brokers about the enthusiasm of their clients. For voluntary benefits. I'm the first to tell you that it's kind of an interesting metric, right? Kind of a softer metric. We're asking people to, the advisor role to represent kind of the overall how excited or engaged, strategic. You can think about it a couple of different ways that their clients overall are being for this category. But we do it because when we started doing it, it seemed to follow suit with sales and employer offerings going up, sales going up, et cetera, all those different dials. And it has ever since. So we've kind of continued to do it as sort of our Groundhog Day type of little metric here. So not necessarily a surprise in it, but we do continue to see this go north. And it's the same thing for employees. We've done the same thing. We've always continued to see those kind of follow suit with one another. But we've also had a benefit of just kind of an ever-growing industry, save those 2 years I mentioned up front. So I don't know how much there is to say on that. I mean, Eric, unless you've got, unless it resonates with you in some way.
No. It's fairly accurate. And I would say the voluntary enthusiasm from the voluntary brokers is going to certainly be a lot higher. So right. I would argue it's skewed a little bit on that side, but the broker side doesn't surprise me. What do you got next?
These last couple were just some different things relative to employer paid versus employee paid versus contributory. And, we can see how some of the security column up there is kind of touching on, supplemental health and some of the other products more aligned with true voluntary. And you can still see some of the how they're sort of spread out across employer paid, contributory,
right,
and voluntary.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add on that one.
And more interesting on the kind of the additional products down below, right? The non-traditional stuff that you do still see some of these products getting employer dollars, right? And I think we've both seen that oftentimes it's a nice offset. If I have to do something tough on the medical side that costs people more money, does it help to introduce something on that side? And this was actually the last slide. At the end of the day, I like this metric because it's sort of when you ask an employer, this is specifically something we ask employers, right? What do you want to see have happen? So we have reasons for offering, we have different metrics, but we're trying to kind of get more out, like, what's the outcome for you, right? And you can see that it all boils down to improved employee well-being and productivity with, some other things selected in here. And I've got a lot of different thoughts on this. We wrote a whole article about some of the catch-22s in these things, and I won't go off on it right now. But at the end of the day, this is where I really want to message participation. We have this answer in here that's really all about well-being. And yeah, for the individuals, the 5% or the 15% or 20% who invest in these programs, their well-being is improved. But just by offering them, saying it's on the shelf isn't enough, right? And that's, you know, I've talked a lot about mechanics and working conditions, and how that, it doesn't have to be a face-to-face enrollment to get more people to find, reason to actually stop and think if they need this, and probably invest if they get the right level of education and insight around it. So I think participation is just still sort of a missing marker oftentimes at the employer level in planning.
We have a 3, 4, maybe 5 minutes left if you want to stick around. I know we started a few minutes late. Let me get to these last few questions, though. We have some really good ones here. So a couple I spotted in the chat. Nick, David wants to know, who do you, at Eastbridge, of course, who do you consider to be quote unquote voluntary brokers? Are they enrollment firms, street agents? Is it simply a broker who doesn't sell major medical but only sells VB? Or can you give us some
fair question. So those, we just have these two high level segments we use in these types of settings. When we work with carriers, we can get much more granular, and that voluntary bucket would definitely include, an enrollment specialist, somebody who's classically focused on working through other brokers, typically with the toolkit of, let me help manage that election process to maximize participation. Then beneath that, though, we've always sort of seen another segment that we refer to as classics. So somebody who's not necessarily working through other brokers, maybe came out of a Colonial or Aflac, learned voluntary that way, but is just going, employer direct, maybe calling on old clients. There's a whole segment there around that. And, the big kind of unique thing about those two types of organizations, obviously, is there's far less of them compared to your traditional employer paid program EB broker, but the per capita production in voluntary is just night and day different. So when you're working with carriers like we do, or help people at different times in their business identify which of these various segments are really going to be able to work with. So at its highest level, at the next foundational level, those two would be included in there. We do not include agents. Agents are captive, so because we're not helping people, that's not going to be an outlet.
Right.
Even though they're sophisticated in voluntary benefits, it's not going to be an outlet from a segmentation standpoint.
So Nick, lightning round, let's wrap up these last few and we'll be out of here. Anybody that has to leave, obviously, we appreciate you. And check out bcsf.com or essentialcare.com is their other internal voluntary site, essentialcare.com. And thanks again to BCS for putting this together, and thank you, Nick. Last couple questions. One, Steve asks, are we seeing voluntary sales decrease with inflammation with inflation and economic uncertainty? In my case, I can give you the bird's eye view because I see it daily
right now. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm not. We're still we're not an enrollment firm, and we do everything 100% virtual through self-serve, through the benefit administrative portals. And we are seeing 40, 50, 60, 70% participation. We're seeing increases in all lines. So I can't personally tell you that I've experienced or that our accounts across the country have experienced any decrease due to inflation or economic uncertainty. Maybe, Nick, that's a question that you may want to, if you didn't already have, maybe you add that to a survey in the future. But let me ask this last question to you, Nick, and then we'll close it out. David also asked another question. He said, do we have any data or insight about how much of an effect the data exchange between carriers and Ben admins has on persistency?
I can tell you the first statistic that comes to mind. I can tell you, I think it's the number 2 reason brokers tell us they switch carriers or might look to go reshop an existing case is the problems in the data exchange. Number 1 would be billing. Number 2 or 3, number 2 might be other administrative issues or something like that. Right behind that would be the specific challenges of data integration. So yeah, it's a big deal. And I know every carrier we work with, we're trying to find solutions and help them get better at it. And I know it's on their radar. It's a good question.
Yeah, I would second that. Most carriers I work with know that if they're not currently integrated with the various platforms, they know that they are going to potentially miss out on some opportunities if the connectivity is not there. Most of the big ones on the list on the first slide, I would say, are probably can't vouch for that, but I would imagine most of them are probably connected. But I know many others are getting there. So Nick, appreciate you, my friend, as always. Everybody
Fun
listening,
chatting with you, Eric.
it was fun.
Yeah.
If you haven't already connected with Nick or I on LinkedIn, please change that immediately. We'd love to touch base. And Nick has a monthly column in Benefits Pro magazine. Check it out. Every month he's sharing nuggets of wisdom that you can get some good stuff from. I know I certainly do. And then finally, we'll be pushing it out more next week, but just released this week is Nick Rockwell. If you need more Nick in your life, he is this week's Rockstars Rockin' podcast. I put the link in the chat below. I thought that would be a nice segue. So those who want to get more deeply in understanding Eastbridge and Nick and so forth, check it out anywhere podcasts are consumed. Thanks again to BCS Financial. Appreciate you all. And please go ahead and check them out. You will not regret it. Thanks, everybody. Make it a great day.
Thank you all.